Again, thank you to the newcomers who have arrived in the course of our proceedings for their attendance, and a big welcome to our next set of witnesses, who are known slightly menacingly as external witnesses, but we're immensely grateful to Scott, to Paul and to Pete for joining us this evening. So that we can ask them questions about the options and models for ownership and management outside the council context. And I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves and to say a bit about themselves and what they do, and then we'll go straight into the questions. So why don't we begin with you, Scott?
Hello, I'm Scott Dorling. I'm a partner at Trowers & Hamlins, which is a law firm in the city. My colleague Ian Doolittle is helping the Commission. I have worked at Trowers for the last 11 years, and before that I was at Lawrence Graham, which is another law firm in the city, and before that I was an in-house lawyer at Camden and Islington Councils, and before that I was in Australia. So I'm originally Australian and spent now half my life over here, and since moving from in-house legal, where I did housing law, did lots of possession work, antisocial behaviour, and also homelessness provision, I've moved to the private sector, where I've subsequently done significant work on stock transfer and worked with setting up the Kensington Chelsea TMO when it turned from a TMO into an LMO, but kept its TMO status. And so I've done stock transfer since 2000, and most recently did the Durham stock transfer, which was the most recent completed stock transfer to a new group of landlords, 19,000 properties. And I've also worked extensively in Wales, where the community housing mutual model is the favoured model of the Welsh Government. And so I can talk a bit about my experience in Wales, and also for some of the community gateway models as well, where I've worked with Preston Community Gateway Association, and also with Rochdale, where we also did the stock transfer to Rochdale Borough Homes, the mutual model that's being established there. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Paul?
Hi, I'm Paul Doe. I'm the Chief Executive of Shepherd's Bush Housing Group. Shepherd's Bush Housing Group owns about 5,000 properties in West London, and the vast majority, I think over 3,000, are in Hammersmith and Fulham, so this is our home borough. I've been at Shepherd's Bush now for 18 and a half years, so the skeletons are in the cupboard, out the cupboard, in the cupboard, out the cupboard. Anyway, and I know the borough very well.
Evening, I'm Pete Redman. I started as a rent collector at Islington in 1974, and I've been really fortunate in my career to work for a number of housing organisations and residents and housing people to set up all kinds of different organisations. I've helped establish TMOs, estate management boards, ALMOs, as we know, Lambeth Living, and I have to say I've also had to dismantle them sometimes when they go wrong. So perhaps we could look at what works and what doesn't work in some of the questions. And I've retired from heavy lifting after running Notting Hill, running Lambeth Housing, running Southwark Housing. And now in my retirement I am doing policy and research work and giving financial advice from a city firm to social housing providers, to local authorities and to infrastructure companies.
Thanks, Pete, and we'll follow up on your suggestion about what works and what doesn't work in due course. Can I say, colleagues, that I think each of our questioners will probably begin by putting a question to an individual witness, but we'd be grateful if you thought that you had something to add, would come in, so don't hesitate to come in. So let's turn to Peter Bevington to ask the first question in this session.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll address this one to Scott, if I may, to start with. And I wanted to ask Scott if you could start by giving us an overview of the range of ownership and management options that could be available to the council at the present time, with particular reference to the scope that each might offer to residents for them to be involved.
Okay. The witness just before us talked to some extent about some of the models that are available in the market, and I'll start with management before moving on to the ownership model. So effectively the management models are what might be available in the event that there is no transfer of stock from the council to a new registered provider of social housing. So I guess the most obvious starting point is the status quo. The status quo could continue as it is, or there could be enhancements to the way in which residents, and by residents I mean tenants and leaseholders, are involved in the decision making. And so that becomes part of the way in which the strategy that the council develops either enhances the present arrangements, builds upon them, or sets up new arrangements for devolution of some management responsibility without necessarily setting up any new organisation to do so. So there could be devolution of budgets, where there are certain authorities that have passed on estate budgets to residents to make their own decisions about that. So the first point in terms of management is it right? Is it working right now? Do residents want something more? Can there be enhancements to the way in which the residents are involved in the day-to-day decisions about their properties? The second option is one that Hammersmith and Fulham have already tried to some extent, which is the establishment of an arm's length management organisation. And the thing to bear in mind now with arm's length management organisations, or ELMOs, is that there is no longer any statutory guidance that underpins the establishment of an ELMO. An ELMO was initially established from the government's mantra to separate strategy from management, on the basis that the government believed that if you separate those out into separate organisations, so the council maintaining the strategy and a company, because all ELMOs have been set up as companies limited by guarantee, if a company does the management, there will be an improvement in both. And ELMOs were effectively forced upon local authorities to some extent as the means to attract decent homes funding. Councils had to either do a stock transfer or set up an ELMO or enter into a PFI arrangement to get the decent homes funding. We've seen new ELMOs established without the availability of additional money. So recently Shropshire have decided to set up an ELMO. Welland Hatfield set up an ELMO just for the purpose of separating the strategy from the management. So your experience in this council of establishing an ELMO might not necessarily be the historical pointer to setting up an ELMO in the future. So there's still some mileage, I think, in the setting up of an ELMO. Aaron mentioned tenant management organisations. The right to manage has been around for many years. Kensington and Chelsea have set up the only whole stock management organisation, but there are a number of estate-based TMOs throughout the country, and so the option in terms of setting up a TMO could be there in terms of a whole stock solution. And with a TMO, the requirement is that all tenants and or leaseholders have the right to become members of the organisation, and that there is a range of different approaches to governance at the board level. So you can have TMOs, which are wholly tenant-led, or you can have TMOs like Kensington and Chelsea, where there is a range of tenants, independents and council nominees. So there is no model for a tenant management organisation, but the usual position is that all tenants have the right to become members of the organisation, so therefore are effectively owners of the company or the Industrial and Provident Society, and tenants are in the governing position on the board. And Aaron also mentioned the idea of estate management boards. Estate management boards are another model which is available for localised management decisions to be made in terms of things like, as Aaron mentioned, caretaking, grounds maintenance, repairs and the like. So there are a number of management options which are available to the council if it chooses that the stock transfer route is not the route it wishes to put to tenants. Then turning to the ownership options, if there is a stock transfer, the usual model for a stock transfer is what we call the third model. So that is established on the basis that tenants have a third of the places on the board, the council has a third of the places on the board, and independents have a third of the places on the board. That's the standard model supported by the Homes and Communities Agency and has been the traditional model for years in stock transfers. And that third at board level is usually reflected in the ownership level, so at membership. So tenants have a third of the votes at membership level, council has a third of the votes at membership level, and so do the independents. And the reason that the third is important is that significant decisions requiring significant decisions, particularly affecting the rules or a transfer of engagements or amalgamation with another organisation, require a 75% vote of the members of the organisation. So if the tenants have a third of the votes, the tenants collectively can block that resolution. So effectively they and the council block and the independent block can block those significant decisions. So it gives a degree of power to each of the constituency blocks. But what we have seen over the years is a distinction being made between what's called open membership and closed membership. And open membership means that anyone who's eligible, like any tenant, can apply to become a member of those organisations. Closed membership means the board at any time are the members of the organisation. And so that creates some degree of democratic deficiency in organisations which have chosen to close their membership. Open membership allows all tenants to continue to be members of the organisation. And that model then has led to the idea that there should be something more for tenants in terms of the ownership. And so we've seen the development of the community housing mutual model in Wales, which effectively, in its pure form, and not many, there's been 11 stock transfers in Wales, and the community housing mutual model is the recommended model by the Welsh Government. Only 2 or 3 have adopted the pure form. The others have adopted what they say are community mutual rules, but they've adapted them. The pure form is that only tenants and or leaseholders, depending upon the way in which the council views it, are members of the organisation. But all of the organisations in Wales have adopted a board arrangement which has the distinction between tenants having a third, council nominees having a third, and independents having a third. Some of them have tenants with more than the third, but no organisation has tenants in a majority on the board. And there are reasons for that in terms of registration with the Welsh Government, and the same with HCA, and also funding in terms of decision making by boards which could be majority led by tenants. And so building on from the community housing mutual model, the community gateway model has developed in England. And the first one was in Preston, which is the Community Gateway Association. There's been a couple of others since. And effectively the gateway is the opportunity for tenants to determine how they want to be involved in the management and potentially ownership of their stock. So effectively what the community gateway model does is it requires, as part of the constitution, so it's part of the object of the company, that there is a community involvement strategy, and that there is the establishment of neighbourhoods or areas, and that there's engagement with those neighbourhoods to see what it is that they want in terms of management and possibly devolution of ownership. And so there's a requirement to engage with the neighbourhoods. There's a requirement to, if a majority of neighbourhoods ask the organisation to put forward a proposal, there's a requirement to consult, and ultimately there could be devolution of management responsibilities and ultimately ownership of stock to a neighbourhood within the community gateway area. There's usually an embargo on any devolution of ownership for a period of 5 years to enable the stock transfer organisation to deal with its promises, make sure that it's set off on the right foot, and there's usually a requirement also that there can be no devolution of management or ownership without there being no adverse effect on the business plan, and also a requirement to get funders' consent, because that would be a requirement of the loan agreement. And so, and then moving on finally to the last model, which is the Rochdale model, which we've seen. And I was going to come to you today and say that Rochdale are the only ones that have adopted this so far, but yesterday in Inside Housing it was reported that Merthyr Valleys Homes, which is one of the Welsh housing associations which I helped establish several years ago, have decided to proceed down the same route as Rochdale to establish a democratic forum or a representative body like they've got in Rochdale. And effectively the Rochdale model works on the same community gateway principles, but it allows all tenants to be members of the organisation, but also all staff. The Rochdale model is a combination of ownership by the staff and by the residents. There is then what's called a representative body, and that representative body is 31 strong, and it's made up of 15 tenants who are elected by the tenant members of the organisation, 8 members of staff who are elected by the members of staff, and then there's a range of other people on that board, so people from the TMOs, people from the council, and people from other organisations which share the values. So there could be NHS bodies and others who are on that representative body. And that representative body appoints the chief executive, and appoints the FD, the finance director, and it appoints the chair of the board, and it appoints the non-executive directors of the board. So it's that body which effectively has the direct relationship with the company, with the board, and it sets the strategy, but it appoints and removes, so it has the power to appoint and remove the board. So that representative body is effectively the approach that Rochdale have adopted to enshrine their cooperative principles and their mutual principles in the management of their housing. So that's a very quick run through of a number of the models that are available out there in terms of both management and ownership, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions that come out of that.
Yeah, Paul. I'm sorry, most people want to ask questions. There you go, Paul.
Very quickly, under retention, could you tell us what conditions are required to set up a TMO under retention is?
You need to follow the right to manage regulations. I can't remember what act it's in. Effectively, there needs to be a geographical body of tenants who come together, who, following a mandate, have decided that they want to be in charge of the management of their stock. There's a feasibility study which is carried out beforehand to identify whether it's feasible for the council to transfer the management. Then there's a ballot of the geographical area, and then there is a modular management agreement which the government has identified as being the form of the agreement which needs to be entered into. That is then negotiated between the TMO and the council. The TMO needs to establish itself as a formal corporate body, so that could either be a company limited by guarantee, or what used to be called the Industrial and Province Societies and now Community Benefit Societies. So there needs to be a formal legal entity established to take over the management of the stock. And then there is a requirement, once that happens, for there to be a regular refreshing of the mandate every 5 years. The tenants who are involved in that geographical area need to confirm that they wish those arrangements to continue. And the Kensington and Chelsea TMO was initially set up as a TMO under the right to manage regulations. It then became an ELMO, but retained its TMO status. It's the exception to the rule, effectively, in the ELMO world, that it is not controlled by the local authority. All other ELMOs are wholly owned by the local authority, whereas a TMO is wholly owned by its residents.
Anthony, and then Peter.
Scott, you mentioned that you were involved in the pioneering community gateway in Preston. Can you give us some feedback? We've obviously visited a couple of community gateways in Lewisham and Watford. Can you give us some feedback on, given that they were the pioneering one, what problems they encountered early on, and what advice would you give if a community gateway was to be considered, based on the lessons you learned?
I think the big lesson to learn is to ensure that you have in place at the beginning of the process, once the transfer happens, proper mechanisms to ensure that the majority of people sign up to become members of the organisation. Because if there is if you're setting up an organisation to be wholly owned by the tenants, and you don't get many tenants to sign up to be members, then do you have that democratic deficit, effectively, that you've got 200 people who've decided to sign up, but you've got 10,000 residents? Are those 200 people effectively controlling the destiny of the 10,000? And so therefore, I think there was a lesson learned that there could have, from the word go, a membership drive is the most important thing. It's happened not just with Preston, but in other LSVTs, large-scale voluntary transfer organisations, where there was an expectation that people would want to become members. But a lot of people just don't want to become members unless they're given incentives to become members, and unless they're constantly reminded. For example, in newsletters, what Kensington and Chelsea TMO do very well, and they've got over 5,000 of their tenants and leaseholders signed up to become members of the TMO, is whenever there's a newsletter, there is an application for membership form. So it's a constant theme that you always let people know that there are benefits to becoming a member. You have a say in the running of the organisation. You can attend general meetings. You can vote on significant issues. So in enforcing the benefits of becoming a member and having a good membership drive early on is really key.
Yeah, just again going back to Preston, did you, in order to get the residents to actually vote in favour of a community gateway, what carrots, shall we say, did you employ to present the residents with a positive advantage to actually going down that route?
I didn't put any carrots in front of any of the tenants. That's not the role. In every stock transfer, if the council supports the stock transfer, and I can talk about the right to transfer regulations in a minute if you want to, where councils actually can oppose tenants putting forward a proposal to transfer the stock. But when you're talking about a large-scale voluntary transfer which is supported by the council thinks it's in the best interest of the tenants and itself for the transfer to proceed. That's usually the basis upon which the council's made the decision. So in those circumstances, the offer document, which precedes a whole range of newsletters, a whole range of consultation and communication before you get to the offer document on the doorstep, you can put forward a whole range of things saying what are the benefits of transfer, and one of the benefits of transfer, and there's a whole range of things, is one of the questions that was raised earlier about changes to tenancy conditions. Local authorities can change secure tenancy conditions after consultation with the tenants. Tenants could say, we don't like it, but you consult and you take on board. The local authority can change. A housing association, once you've had your stock transfer, has a contractual agreement with the tenants, and that tenancy agreement can only be changed with the individual consent of the tenant. So it hasn't got the same power to generally change tenancy conditions. So that's a benefit that some tenants find attractive. The other benefits are things like more say in the running of the organisation, for some people, that's an important thing. Some tenants want to be more involved in, or being able to be on the board, being able to be on a representative body to a point. In the gateway model, there is a tenant committee or a gateway committee similar to the representative body, but usually made up of tenants, and they elect onto the board. And if it's a gateway association, as Preston Community Gateway is, then there should be, with the community strategy and the engagement strategy, a whole range of ways in which tenants can be involved in the day-to-day management of their stock. So there's some of the sort of more sort of general things that usually can be said to make people vote yes, but there's also the obvious things like investment, and a stock transfer is usually only proceeds if there is as Aaron mentioned, viability for it, but there's an investment need that can't be met otherwise. And so the idea of getting repairs done more quickly, getting new kitchens done before the council will be able to do it, are obviously things that also need to be put into the mix.
I was just going to say, I was thinking particularly of Watford, where the carrot, if you like, was that they were going to get decent homes money. So that's really what you're relating that to.
Well,
yeah.
and the carrot in Durham, the most recent transfer I did, which wasn't to a community gateway and to a traditional third model, the carrot there was the council had made a decision which went to the full cabinet that if tenants voted no to transfer, there was a plan B, and in Durham they had 2 ELMOs and 1 in-house management organisation. So there were three organisations that had previously come together through local government reorganisation. The plan B was that the council would create a single ELMO, so they'd lose their local manager. And the council had made that decision because they couldn't afford to maintain 3 separate ELMOs, and so that was having the consultation with tenants beforehand about the benefits that they saw in having local managers who were in charge of their stock, and they'd known them for years as ELMOs. And if the transfer didn't happen, the council would go to a single ELMO structure where there'd be no local management. That was a significant matter that convinced tenants to vote yes there.
Just a quick one, because I'm sure we want to move on. With the community gateway model, Scott, are you aware of any that have gone through the devolution route and part of the stock has moved through the gate, I should say?
Not yet. No. I can't remember when Watford is probably still in its 5 years, or very close to its 5 years, and Greenfields in Braintree is not far off that. Preston's a bit older in the tooth, but there has been no devolution of ownership. I think devolution of ownership, whilst it is in the rules that it can be one of the options available to the tenants if they come together in an area, decide on the ballot that they want it, is a difficult route to pursue, but it is theoretically possible, but none have pursued it yet, since I mind.
Thank you. This question is for you, Pete. In your experience of the options and models that you've mentioned, we've mentioned quite a few TMOs, community gateways, etc. Could you talk us through the pros and cons of the ones that you think are most viable, really? And if possible, with reference to the council's present circumstances and how they can involve residents as well.
Yes, I think I can, Lorna. Scott, I think, has described in a very full way that almost any kind of structure is possible. There's so many different variants out there now that what you want can be designed, given certain rules about the power of ownership and degree of resident control. You can more or less build the structure you want. And I would say something unhelpful to start with, which is I've seen good of all kinds and bad of all kinds. So there's no magic bullet out there. Make that real. When I was running Southwark Housing Management, 55,000 households, when people from government came over the river, an audit commission, as it was then, to come and look at us, see how we were doing, I would take them to the local estate management board, still running in Bermondsey Street, because it was just brilliant. So much better than our own direct management as a council. But as I said in my introduction, I've also had to close down organisations which have, and it's a painful process and a lot of wasted time and energy involved as well. So if I were to be helpful, I would say...
Could you hold your microphone closer to your...
Yes, okay, sorry, sometimes I let my hand slip. If I were to be helpful, I would say that organisations in the housing field that have a wide vision and purpose tend to be long-term survivors. Not just good services to existing residents, but building homes, growing, and as Shepherd's Bush do with their independence as a housing association, but very clear sense of purpose, able to attract good new staff in. These are important things that come with growth and progress. And I think of all kinds of organisations, those that have a purpose for the wider community rather than just their existing residents tend to be the longer term survivors. There are examples both ways. Those organisations that are totally resident focused can be brilliant. I've given one example you might want to visit off Bermondsey Street. But they tend to be fragile. And I think the second tier of my answer would be, if you're a management organisation of the various forms, TMOs, EMB, and so forth, the status of your owner is just as important as how you organise yourself. If your owner is fluctuating every election, or even has a continuity of political leadership but every 3 years changes its strategies. This is a very difficult circumstance to deliver a consistent service and to raise money to invest for new housing and so on. So Kensington Chelsea, just over the way, works well for a number of reasons. Scott's touched on some of them, but I don't forget one reason, which is the owner ultimately and the political power of the council have been very stable through the process. And I think that's been true for Richmond Housing Partnership in their relationship with their original local authority landlord. So management can be a good route. We did some great things in Lambeth to up the quality of the service through Lambeth Living. It's done its job, I think. But if the ultimate say-so is going to chop and change in what it's doing, it's very hard to be a good managing agent. So I think that would be my summary, that a wider sense of purpose tends to give a long-run life and health to an organisation, and a management arrangement of whatever sort really does depend on who your owner is that can tell you to go away if it doesn't like your management, for example.
Can I just ask about some of the failures? You mentioned that you've had to shut down some organisations, and can you just give us an idea of some of the reasons behind that? Just for things to avoid.
It's very hard to plan for some of these things. And I think, as probably most lawyers would say, you have to think about all the things that can go wrong beforehand and work out your way through it. A bit like a successful marriage, perhaps. But I have seen organisations go under because one or two people are crooks. Fraudulent. I've seen organisations fade away because the initial enthusiasm wore off, and there was no real sense of purpose or leadership to keep it going. I've seen organisations make big mistakes, borrowing more than it can afford to pay back and things like that, and often others will come in and pick up the pieces. I think it's worth saying that, and one I find difficult because it's very, very hard not to take a position on this, I've seen residents' organisations being captured by a minority of people. Sometimes people with the best intentions, they feel, the best intentions of all, but that makes it vulnerable to them ageing or moving away or not being elected again. So a well-run residents-led organisation needs continual investment in and turnover of people to bring people forward, as Scott mentioned about membership in those cases, and capture by and in fact I've seen capture by political parties working through residents, almost I think despicable, actually, using residents as a sort of football and trying to win a political argument. That's not what a good housing service is about, and it can destroy trust within the organisation. So all these things happen, I'm afraid.
So it sounds like it's a kind of a wide vision, far-reaching vision beyond just initial repairs, and also having a renewed sense of membership and evolving and dynamic, which is good. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on that, Pete, and other colleagues as well? Because I'm very interested myself in this issue of the renewal of the resident body. And I've said all the way through in the work of this commission that in any proposal that we came forward with, what we would need to do is to build into it arrangements and provisions for the renewal of representativity and resident engagement and all the rest of it. What are the arrangements, in your experience, that you can put in place to prevent that capture of organisations, which frankly we have seen all too often in resident-led bodies by small and unrepresentative groups?
Well, you have to start with your constitution, because in difficult times you fall back on your rules. So I've just retired from being chair of Duquesne Housing Association, just up towards Old Oak, a partial stock transfer, by the way, in Old Oak. My term was 5 years. So whilst everyone, I think, wanted me to carry on and, best thing since sliced bread, we just said, no, someone else's turn. So that's part of it, I think, Keith. And another part of it is to kind of make it worthwhile, because you're not going to get people coming forward all the time. I was the development worker for Holloway Tenant Cooperative in North Islington. And we in a room like this, we worked out that most families had 5 things to worry about: education, health, jobs, housing was only one of 5. So we couldn't expect everyone to be involved all the time. So let's have a structure where at least a fifth are going to be active and maybe elect a committee so that they can do the hard work. And we sort of got real about how much people could get involved. Another example is, I think, were you involved in Bron Afon in South Wales? Yeah, they're now rethinking not their rules, but how they engage with all their shareholder members, to the vast majority of their residents, because most of them are more interested in employment projects, in tackling antisocial behaviour, and in helping and caring for neighbours, rather than trying to run the business of a landlord. So they're kind of reorganising the way residents get involved. So you have to be attractive. You can't just offer people hard work. And then finally, you need to put resources into it. Committed staff, external consultants can often help with resident engagement. You can't just do it from door knocking. You need to try everything available to bring people forward. And it can be wonderful. I can remember a resident member of the board at Notting Hill, and the banker also on the board. He was chief exec of Coutts Bank, and he was very concerned about the behaviour of some children in the street, and how come social services, in this case Kensington, weren't doing their job, and the tenant member was concerned about our gearing ratio. That we didn't over-borrow, and he had a common sense approach to sometimes a technical business matter, and it was worth its weight in gold in terms of help steering the direction of the organisation. So people surprise you, but you need to open the door to them.
Paul, why don't you say a word about sustaining resident engagement?
Well, and also renewal. I mean, I agree with absolutely everything that Pete's had to say about this, and also the long-term vision thing, which is very important. But I too am standing down as a chair of St Mungo's, Broadway, the homeless charity. And I've been 5 years as a chair. Time to go. And it doesn't matter how long you've been there, it does matter how long you've been there. It doesn't matter how good you are, your time is up. And it is very important to get those things right at the start. So when people join a board, they know that their time will be up. They also have a good code of conduct, and it is used. They have good appraisal systems, and they are used. Yeah, so that people constantly know on the board, as much as on any resident group, that they are valued, they are being supported, but they're also being called to account. Yeah, and we shouldn't be afraid of any of that, because sometimes I think we back off from those things because we say you're volunteers and therefore please come. But actually, it's important that we get it right. But in terms of resident renewal, I mean, I'd agree with what Peter said about, it's not just people stepping forward because they want to come to a meeting at 7:30 at night. A lot of people that we engage with at Shepherd's Bush have come through as volunteers in the organisation, often wanting to give something back, which didn't involve resident involvement, but something completely different. Some of them wanted a job, they wanted to have some training, and we will basically, our message to our staff is engage with anybody about anything and give them the opportunity to step through any particular operation that we have in the organisation. So you give them a menu and you give them that opportunity. We're just about to go through our second round of resident elections directly onto our board and onto our resident voice, our scrutiny panel. And again, we are having elections because we are oversubscribed. People want to stand, which is great.
Okay, a question for Scott now. In terms of retention, from your experience, what would the typical criteria of a council be to measure retention and whether it's the best option?
One of the key issues is the debt, and whether or not the attributable debt can be met through a transfer. And so to the extent that there is, I don't know what your debt is, I should have researched this before, what the council's debt is, I imagine is quite a lot, that if there is no government write-off of housing debt, then a stock transfer could only proceed if someone was coming in to pay that debt off. And so that would mean, it would ultimately mean that you would not be able to finance it setting up your own standalone organisation. You'd be looking for someone to support the transfer, so one of the big RPs coming in, and whether or not you could be a standalone subsidiary or not, or whether you get subsumed into another RP, and that might not be an attractive message for a vote. So I think the key issue is, it was mentioned by Aaron, is it viable from the council? It might be exactly what the tenants want, and there could be a test of opinion to see whether or not that is the case. But if the ballot is in favour, but the council cannot financially support the transfer, you've still got to go to the full council to get approval. So viability and not a significant impact on the general fund would be, I think, the key issues that the council would need to be satisfied with, that would allow them to proceed with going down the route of a transfer.
Joanne, do you want to follow up on that?
Well, just really in terms of the environment that housing associations and councils are currently operating under and the government agenda, and we'll hear more about that this week. If a council's looking at both options, what view do you think it might take about the impact of that external factors?
Yeah, where do we start?
Well, that is, I mean, Aaron referred to some of the pressures and difficulties of operating as a council landlord, and the pressure is on, and who knows what we'll hear in the budget. I mean, anyway, we'll hear. The longer term pressures are really about the nature of public money and private money, I think. The chances in the medium term, and by that I mean 10 to 15 years, of us having a massive increase in public money to support investment through public bodies, councils, are quite remote. And I think that's ironic, given the operation of Hammersmith and Fulham Stock is a business that works in itself. You know, it's probably paying for a bit of the town hall as well along the way. But I think the chances of masses of injection of public money are very, very unlikely. The other side of that coin, as it happens at the moment, the world is awash with people looking to put private money into a safe haven. So housing associations, particularly in London and the South East, are able to borrow at really fine rates and deliver that percentage more dwellings each time they do a scheme because of it, and invest in the older stock more effectively. So it might not be how we want the world to be, but I think the financial and political reality is that resources are unlikely to be readily available for local authorities. Don't you agree with that?
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. I think that the operating environment is going to be quite interesting as well. I think that I can see nothing other than constant pressure being applied on local authorities to cut back year on year. And whilst I feel that as well in a housing association setting, because obviously I need to provide good value for money, we have ways of developing new initiatives and new ideas that are beyond the constraints of being within a local authority. And you know, the reason that I wanted to join a local authority and that this is the best job I've ever had is because, you know, with your board and with your staff, you can develop a vision where you can take the residents to, you know, a better place in terms of the quality of service and the ideas that you can generate. I have to say that after 17 years in local authorities, I was struggling to provide.
Sounds as though you might want to
Just wanted to
go with that one.
No, let's go to questions.
Please, you've got one, then I've got one.
If I may, Keith, I just want to refer back to something that Aaron was talking about in the first section about the separation between the council's strategic role and its landlord role. And given the circumstances that we look at currently and what Pete said about the importance of having a stable long-term vision and be able to look at what you can do in your community and the pressures on public funding, there might be lots of kind of temptation to look at a transfer as a safer route. But in the event of a transfer, surely the relationship between the transfer organisation and the local authority is a crucial one. In other words, the ability of the council to be sure that the organisation that's been set up to look after its housing is going to play that wider role and help it meet some of its strategic objectives. How do you achieve that and avoid the transfer landlord floating off and becoming the plaything of the funders?
Well, I mean, ultimately, you can't write that down in rules. You need to get the right people around your table in a transfer organisation who understand those relationships. The transfer to a housing association model or to a community gateway model is not a move to complete independence. We're all dependent on other parties, particularly our democratically elected local authorities. And so it's a two-way thing. The transfer leadership and board members need to understand the importance of that relationship. But it does depend also on how the council develops. And we've got some good examples. For better or for worse, Westminster maintains a very strategic role, yet it's outsourced its housing function. Kensington Chelsea has quite a strong strategic role in terms of housing. The Greater London Authority is one of the best strategic housing bodies in the world. It doesn't run any housing anymore. Yet we see some local authorities, perhaps more in the smaller rural districts and so on, where the move out of capable senior staff from a local authority into a transfer organisation leaves the council threadbare with no resources to really do a good job, and that's sad in my view. Ultimately, whoever you are, I would say, whether you're a stock transfer association or a partial transfer like in Old Oak or an independent housing association like Shepherd's Bush, you have a degree of accountability to the democratically elected body which will have a strong say in who delivers services in its area and who doesn't. And that form of audit, if you like, by a local authority, whether it's running housing or not, is essential. Most do it all right, but there's some have lost it when they did the stock transfer.
Could I just to follow up very quickly on that? I mean, you're absolutely right to pick that out as a potential danger, because there are many one-third stock transfers that fairly quickly lose a third. And that third that normally goes first is the councillors, actually. They wither on the vine. They see less they sometimes they don't bother coming along or whatever, but they do tend to drop back. And the third is taken up by other independents and the residents as well. So you get a 2/3, 1/3 split like that, which is actually what I've got in my own traditional housing association. And then they change their name. And they're no longer called North Lincolnshire Homes, they're called OnGo, or whatever you want to call them, but the first thing they do is change their name, because actually then they start looking at sites outside their local authority area. And you think, what is the link back to where they came from? And that actually is a decision that's taken by the board. The board takes those decisions. And they make the decision to actually change their name or to move into different areas. So it is all down to the vision of the board and what the board wants to make happen in the organisation. Because if they do change, they're the people letting it happen.
Could I just follow quickly? Is there anything, though, Paul or Pete or any of you, is there anything that the local authority can do in setting up this relationship or these arrangements at the outset to protect against that in the future?
Well, the transfer agreement is the obvious point where the relationship between the council and the new organisation can be set out in writing, and there is a leap of faith that's taken by the local authority in transferring the stock, and so the council has basically entrusted someone else to take over the stock and is trusting them to do what the constitution says. But the key protection that the council has is, and even if you move away from the third of the board, the third vote of the council nominees, or the council as a corporate body at membership level, is usually not given up as easily as the board places. So if the council retains, in a traditional model, a third of the votes at board level, then a significant change to the constitution, which could be not a change of name, but an amalgamation with another organisation to merge, requires the council's consent for that. And if the relationship is poor and the council doesn't believe that it's the right thing to do, and the organisation hasn't brought the council with them in terms of why it's the best thing for the business, then the council wielding 33% of the votes with one hand can say no. And we've seen that in organisations where there has been a very poor relationship established between the council and the stock transfer organisation, where certain changes to the rules were put to the membership vote, and they were not passed because the council had decided that they weren't supportive of that. So you've got contractual provisions, but you've also got the constitution, which is usually the starting point for the council to say, actually, here's where we have a degree of control.
Can I just go back to Pete's observation, which is that the world's awash with money, and I think the suggestion that there might well be housing associations eager to invest in Hammersmith and Fulham, which suggests the possibility of a merger with a larger external housing association. My suspicion is that the local instinct in Hammersmith and Fulham is rather, if we contemplate stock transfer, to move to a local transfer organisation. And what I wanted to ask you was, what would be the conditions necessary that you would look for transfer to a local Hammersmith and Fulham transfer organisation?
The first thing I would say is to do exactly what you're doing, which is taking a calm, mature, long-term look at what the options are for the future. You know, there's too many events in change in housing organisations that I've seen that have been as a result of some crisis or some short-term impact that has made people want to change. Well, maybe that's how sometimes change happens, but it's not always the right way for a long-term solution. So take your time and ensure that you have an idea, a proposition. There's experts around who can help you with some of the details that the majority of residents will support. That delivers the local authority of any political persuasion. There's no way that a strong majority of residents' views can really be overlooked, and I think that's progress in the landlord-tenant relationships that we've had in the past in this country. So those are the first two things. Secondly, there are some technical matters. Scott's mentioned the current debt position of the council. If the council stock is not worth enough after this stock condition survey that we've heard, it might be a big bill there, that means that its current debt is greater than its stock is worth, then we've got a bit of a problem, because there are no ways now that I see government plugging that gap and writing off the debt, and that nor could a new stock transfer association pick up all of the debt. It can only pick up what the rents can pay after repairs and management and so on. So there's some factual things that would need to be right. You need a good leadership of the political side of the council, and I think you're in a very fortunate position here in having a listening leadership that's open to ideas. So that we could almost tick that one if you don't take too long, perhaps. And then you mentioned sort of whether a stock transfer association should team up with an existing association. In my experience, that's tended to happen both ways: a traditional association picking up a stock transfer, or a stock transfer association picking up a traditional one, because a stronger one is able to help a weaker one. It's rarely happened through just sort of some sort of mutual agreement of, we want to work together in this area. So, for example, Richmond Housing Partnership has picked up some housing associations, cooperative housing associations actually, in Hounslow because they were losing their way a bit and needed support, and I think they still run them, don't they? Be the strong one, I think, would be my answer to that part of it. Don't put yourself in a position where you're fragile and someone else might come and take you over or give you support. And I think you can be strong. Paul's mentioned Ongo, dreadful name. One of the pleasures of my job now is going to talk to housing associations all over the UK. I was in Dublin last Monday trying to help people develop social housing. And I see far more than you ever see when you're busy running one organisation. And I used to run Leeds Federated Housing Association, which was the best in Yorkshire and Humberside. I have to say that. Yeah, it was definitely the best. We had a very good partnership with the local authorities, did ridings, and we had a great partnership together as housing associations and delivered 3,000 homes through a shared programme, additional homes. But one of my visits recently was to Scunthorpe, where the stock was transferred to North Lincolnshire Homes. They have teamed up with other, a Grimsby-based housing association and others. And within about 15 minutes of being in reception, being taken through to the finance director's office, meeting some of the staff on the way, I got a feeling that, wow, there's something going on here. So I stayed a bit longer, didn't have to rush to the next meeting, so went to look at some of the estates and chatted to residents. They were the best resident service provider in Yorkshire and Humberside. Not even heard of.
Lincolnshire. I'm from Lincolnshire, and so is Scunthorpe.
But the north bit, the north bit,
Lincolnshire.
yeah, the north bit of Lincolnshire, yeah. They're unsung heroes. Absolutely fantastic quality of service from a very fragile and economically very poor community in its base. Didn't have the buzz of the city of Leeds, and I just thought if they can do it, that really knocks spots off other people.
But I'll just say very true, because I didn't just pluck Ongo out of the air. I mean, I too have been... it seems strange to be praising Scunthorpe. Here we are in Hammersmith and Fulham, but it is very true what can happen when a large-scale stock transfer with vision, because they have also set up an employment agency, because they recognise that jobs are important in that area. They've set up a furniture reuse service. Those sorts of things. They've recognised it's not just new homes, but also a quality of life that flows from those sorts of things. And that comes from, having the right vision and then going for it. So it's not just the change of name, it's also other things as well.
Well, I think now.
This one should be quite short because I think you've already answered it. But from the council's point of view, what criteria would a retention option have to satisfy?
Scott.
I thought that was the question I answered already. Joanna.
What would transfer option
I answered the question. Yeah, I think it needs.
What would retention have to satisfy?
I think it's the rest provided.
Because you've answered the question from the perspective of transfer, but not retention.
No, we didn't. It was round the other way.
All right. So why would the council want to retain the stock?
The question was posed, and you answered it from the perspective of transfer, but under what conditions would it be favourable, or what criteria would the retention option have to satisfy? Could the council be forced to do a transfer, or is there certain criteria under which retention would be the option, the only option?
All right. Well, the new right to transfer regulations came into force last year, so there is now a statutory right for a body of tenants to come together to require the feasibility study to pursue a transfer of ownership. So there can be a statutory requirement for tenants to come together. It certainly wasn't the intention, I think, for a whole stock solution, but it certainly is available for estates and TMOs. We're working one or the moment where a tenant management organisation is pursuing the right to transfer against the wishes of the council. And what we normally see in a stock transfer is the council pursuing a transfer with an offer document to the tenants and saying it is in our view the best option, but it's for you tenants to decide. What we see in that instance is the local authority being forced under the statutory regime to put an offer to tenants where the council is able to say, we do not think this is the right thing to do for the following reasons. So you can find yourself in a situation where the statutory right to transfer, which no one has pursued yet but is now on the books, can put the council and a resident body at loggerheads. But looking at why would the council want to retain its stock or go down the option of retention rather than transfer, the key issue is whether or not tenants have put forward a good case that the tenants want to pursue this. If there is not a groundswell of support for the council to pursue an option which takes a lot of time and costs a lot of money to consult tenants and ultimately lead to a ballot with a very expensive offer document going out to 12,000 or so properties, then the council would not pursue the option. So it's making sure that through this process there is a body of opinion which the council is convinced represents the majority view or a significant view of the tenants that pursuing stock transfer is in the best interest of the tenants. Pete mentioned the issue about debt. I mentioned it as well. I wouldn't write off the idea that there could be some money from government for overhanging debt write-off. All the 3 transfers that proceeded last year needed debt write-off from government, and they all received some. So there was the availability of a pot, I think it was a £460 million, that was available for those 3 transfers. Some of it was transferred into this year's budget, which is why the Durham transfer didn't happen until April, because the government wanted to carry forward some of the money. So there is the potential for the government to, or it needs to be Treasury to come up with money if the tenants and the council wishes to pursue a transfer because it's in the best interest of the tenants to deliver the investment needs that the council wouldn't be otherwise able to deliver on time or for the quality that the tenants want. The government could be persuaded to pursue it. So the retention option is really, I think the criteria is that we don't think the tenants support the option of a transfer.
Just quickly, just to clarify something you raised really earlier on about the estate management board and the third being tenants, council and independents. When you said the first third is tenants, am I excluding leaseholders completely from that third?
It entirely depends on the organisation itself. If you're looking at, for example, the Preston Community Gateway, they have 5 tenants. No, sorry, Watford has 7 tenants, of which 1 is a ring fence place for a leaseholder on the board. And I think Braintree Greenfields also has a ring fence place for leaseholders. In the Rochdale model, the members are tenants and staff, and when I say tenants, I mean tenants. Leaseholders are not members of the organisation, but can be associate members. So they have the right to attend meetings and speak, but they don't have the right to vote. So it all depends on the relationship at the organisation about how they wish to engage with their residents, and whether that includes leaseholders or not is a matter for the organisation to decide. Whether the membership is tenant only or tenant and leaseholders, and whether the board is tenants only or tenants and leaseholders with a ring fence position, usually for leaseholders because they have usually a smaller number of people and different interests than the tenants usually.
Okay. Just the wording, estate management board, is that excluding street properties?
Not at all. An estate management board can be whatever geographical area is identified as being appropriate. So it could be an entire street, it could be an entire estate, or it could be an entire area. But it is what forms a rational location.
Thank you.
And I think probably to draw our proceedings to a conclusion, I'm going to turn to Anthony Wood.
Yes, I think probably a good final question to round everything up. This is for you, Paul, but the others can chip in as well. As a local registered provider, what do you think are the key issues, or what do you think the key issues are for the council and its residents in considering different ownership and management options at this point in time?
Okay, well, just parking the fact that I'm chief exec of a housing association, I mean, I think what's been said about the process that you're going through in getting all of the options on the table is absolutely the right one. But having said that, I'm an unabashed fan of the housing association world. I do believe that housing associations that are truly independent organisations have the power and opportunity, as long as they develop the vision to go with it, to make great change in an organisation and in an area that they operate in. So from my point of view, in terms of the options that you are looking at, I think there are, clearly there are a lot of options. You've got a host of them there, but I'm here speaking as a chief exec of a housing association, and I think that a housing association option for you would be a good one. I know there are a variety of different ways of doing it. You don't have to do the whole thing as your own stock transfer. You could think about whether partial transfers work to existing housing associations. There are opportunities for you to look at the types of stock that you've got or areas of stock, and whether or not there are opportunities for you to work with existing housing associations on that sort of thing, where you share values. Sometimes it's not just about the money, it's also about the values of an organisation and what you want to do in the future. There are also other things. I mean, housing associations are scattered across the whole of Hammersmith and Fulham. At times there are stupidities in the way that we manage, in that I will cut the grass on a Tuesday and next door the council will cut it on a Wednesday. And there are obviously opportunities for us to think about how we manage those sorts of situations in a better way, irrespective of whether or not ownership is transferred or whatever. There are just better ways of managing these things in the future. So from my point of view, I would encourage you to consider that type of option for the future, alongside all of the others that you've got. And I know there are a host of things here. You've got an awful lot to think about. But you've invited me here to talk about this.
I'll just add one thing. Hammersmith and Fulham is a series of neighbourhoods which are, with 4 other London boroughs, the most expensive housing markets in the world. So what the council's doing, what Shepherd's Bush is doing, other housing bodies in the borough are doing, is incredibly important. And I think the biggest challenge is to move from where you are now to a form of service, and I'm not going to prejudge your outcomes there. It could be retained stock, it could be a stock transfer and the variance on that, but a form of service that rapidly gathers strength and is not undermined by things which are not to do with housing but other political concerns, and contributes to the incredible need for good quality and well-managed affordable housing in this inner London borough.
Would you like a final word, Scott?
Not at all. I don't want to have the final word.
There's a lawyer.
Not the lawyer. The lawyer shouldn't have the final word.
Well, if you look at the agenda, it's my responsibility to have the final word. And let me say that I think on behalf of 2 of my colleagues want the final word. I'm going to give Peter a penultimate word, and then I'm going to give one of our residents the final word. Peter.
Well, if I may, Keith, I just wanted to build a bit more on that point that we've just touched on, which is, I suppose, how do we look beyond the bubble that we're in at the moment, which is a bubble created partly by the political circumstances in the borough, as they are, but also the unique kind of apparent hostility towards social housing and its residents that appears to be coming out of government at this point in time. How do we look beyond those immediate circumstances into the longer term and see what we can establish out of this options appraisal that will be durable and successful?
Well, we cannot go quietly into the darkness, can we? We have to make a fuss. And it's incumbent on all of us who are involved in social housing provision to shout for social housing. In fact, there is a group called Shout who are there at this very moment trying to promote social housing as well. And there is a concern that on our watch we will watch the demise of social housing as it currently is. We've got to be very careful about it. But I think that we must accept that there are going to be pressures, political pressures and financial pressures on us, and our job is to work hard with residents to mitigate those, to continue to provide a high quality service, but also add value in what we do and shout about that too. Because very often we can get locked into the Daily Mail syndrome or the Benefit Street syndrome of, a few people who are suffering in a particular way and not talk about all the other fantastic things that we do and provide. So we've all got a role to play in that. It doesn't matter whether you're council, housing association, TMO, estate management board, we've got to talk up what we do. Well, if Bernie to say it.
Yes, if there's one sort of sense of optimism I have, because I think the circumstances are not good at the moment for resources for social housing, or indeed retaining stock, selling off the highest value and all this, which you may see as very sort of prejudicial. I think part of it actually is they're all trying to grab money back into Treasury, and the principles go out the window. But my optimism is be the best. Get people to help you, work with your staff to be the best service provider. That will see through all sorts of political ups and downs, and indeed even difficulties with money. And that's why we both talked about this Scunthorpe Housing Organisation. They have a future. They are the best. So really work on a model which helps you to deliver the best possible service for you and the wider community.
Well, the agenda says that I do have the final word, so let me say that this has been a fascinating and very important session. And you've left us with a very great deal to think about, and our audience to think about as well. We've heard about stock transfer, the standard third model, which kind of distributes the vetoes amongst the different elements in its composition. We've heard about the community mutuals in Wales, which I think is a bit of a new one on us. We've learnt more about the community gateway model, about which this commission at least has learnt already a good deal, with its strong requirement of engagement and the possibility of devolution of ownership, but the emphasis that from the word go you need to work on its democratic character and resident leadership. And we've heard, of course, about the Rochdale model, a cooperative democratic model involving staff and residents in the ownership of the co-op. But I think at the same time, and this is an important reminder for the Commission, that we've been reminded that the status quo, i.e. no change in ownership, is an option, and that there are a variety of choices within retention by the council. We've heard about the ALMO, which people in Hammersmith and Fulham are already familiar. We've heard about estate management, the board. We've heard about the right to transfer. We've also heard, for example, about councils who are pursuing a policy of devolved budgets. And of course, within tenant management organisations, of which we've heard some debate, we've learnt that there are a range of management options and varying levels of resident involvement. But we've also, of course, recognised that there are many, many challenges to social housing at this particular period of time. And it's our job as a Commission to do our best to buy social housing in Hammersmith, Fulham, and to find a way for the best future for the residents of Hammersmith, of social housing in Hammersmith and Fulham. And that is how we started, and that is how we've continued, and that is how we will conclude. But I also conclude by thanking Scott, Paul and Pete for their absolutely excellent contributions this evening, and I'd like to invite the Commission and our audience to express their gratitude in the conventional fashion. with that, I declare the meeting well and truly closed. Thank you all very much indeed for your attendance.